Now back to our top story, the ongoing unrest in Iraq. Earlier I spoke to Roby Barrett, who is a senior fellow at the Joint Special Operations University. I asked exactly how much pressure is the U.S. and the rest of the world under to wipe out the Islamic State, and is their resolve magnified by the beheading of journalist James Foley?
Well, I think it is. I think that puts a lot of political pressure on the administration. I mean, the White House has done everything it can to avoid continued or even increased involvement in the Syria-Iraq sphere, or what we should call the Levant. But the politics of it are putting enormous pressure on them. And the beheading it just added to that pressure to do something.
The Islamic State leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, could be in Syria, some reports say. What are the potential problems with going into Syria to flush out the Islamic State in the middle of the civil war there?
Well, I mean, seriously, the administration declined to do anything about the Assad regime, which we know has been barbaric in its practices toward its own people, for fear that it would stoke actually a more radical Sunni, emergence of a more radical Sunni regime in the country, and the fact that the Sunnis couldn't get their collective policies together. So now they find themselves in the position of failure to intervene has actually created a situation that has emboldened and increased the influence and power of the radicals. And so, perhaps you would have to do it, just as in the days when we were trying to pacify Anbar. The biggest part of the problem, if you talk to Iraqi officials, was coming from eastern Syria. But I mean, it's a terrible situation to be in, and there really isn't a solution to the problem, but that doesn't mean that you aren't in a position where you have to try to do something to at least ameliorate the situation.
Has the Islamic group surpassed al-Qaeda in terms of funds and troop building?
Well, I think what's very interesting about the Islamic group and how they've handled things is, unlike us, when we entered Iraq in 2003, 2004, and we completely destroyed all the government institutions, sent the army, sent the police, sent everybody home, and decided to rebuild it, what they've done is actually they've co-opted large parts of it. Anybody that will go along with them, they're leaving them alone for now. And so they've done a remarkable job of instituting at least a crude form of government that is beginning to function, and I think this is really what has unnerved the policymakers in Washington. It's something totally unexpected, and once again, it's just not radical Islamist VEO groups or violent extremist organizations. It is a combination of Sunnis that feel disenfranchised. It is a combination of Baathists that feel disenfranchised. And the more radical elements are getting the headlines, but they're getting a lot broader. They're getting a fair amount of broad support in there for people that feel like what has happened in Iraq has basically disenfranchised the Sunnis, who fundamentally ran Iraq for 350 years.
Well, could the West cut a deal with President Assad, allowing him to control part of Syria in exchange for wiping out the Islamic State? And following up on your question, the answer to the question I just asked, would this only give another group more power, and would they come to the forefront of problem?
Well, I think absolutely. When you look at Assad, that's what's happened anyway. That's actually what's going on. Assad controls the areas that are dominated by the minorities. The Christians are with Assad, the Shia are with Assad, the Druze are with Assad, more or less. I mean, this is a generalization, but more or less. And of course, all of the Alawites are with Assad. And the reason is they see in a Sunni-dominated, despite the fact that the Sunnis are 66% of the population of Syria, they see a Sunni-dominated state as leading them as the odd man out and heavily persecuted, if not even attempts to eliminate them. And historically, this is what happened. But I think the other thing that we're making a mistake here is in talking about Syria and Iraq as states. Syria and Iraq no longer exist. It was apparent to anybody that really understood the historical context that by 2004, 2005, 2006, Iraq had disintegrated. Now Syria has disintegrated. And so we have a completely different dynamic where Damascus really doesn't have much control or say about what happens in eastern Syria. And the government in Baghdad has very, very little control anywhere. But if we count the Shia areas, it's only in those traditional Shia areas from Baghdad south. So it's not a real state. Neither one are real states anymore. The United States is the only country in the world where the policymakers still believe that the Sykes-Picot agreement made during World War I between the British and French is the context in which events are happening in the Middle East here 100 years later.
Roby Barrett, thank you so much for your time and insight. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you.